I know this must feel very strange, but ordinary is just what you're used to. This may not seem ordinary to you right now, but after a time it will. This will become ordinary.
Aunt Lydia from The Handmaid's Tale, and this is an awful book cover, so I'm going to use my luscious hardcover version of The Testaments instead. Aunt Lydia from The Handmaid's Tale is not the psychopath that we're comfortable watching like Hannibal Lecter, precisely because we know he's fictional, and you aren't filled with awe when she steps onto the screen like Darth Vader. Aunt Lydia uses very real abusive tactics in a way that gets really hard to watch, especially because we see her and the awful people around us. And you know what? She's even worse in the books. We will be discussing abuse and how it works in this video, both in families and in relationships. If you aren't comfortable with that, that's totally okay, but I recommend not watching this video. This video is part of the this Villainous scene playlist, where a bunch of us creators got together to talk about great scenes with great villains. Link below, go watch. The Handmaid's Tale is a dystopian novel based in the Republic of Gilead, a theocratic, patriarchal America in which the few women who can still give birth are made into handmaids, passed around the ruling class and forced to bear their children against their will. Aunt Lydia is the woman at the top of it all who brutalizes them into this role. Listen to just her first line in this scene.
They were dirty women. They were sluts. But you are special girls.
This is a very common tactic that abusers will use to control their victims. Children, family, friends, partners. They will make the victim feel special, but not because of any of their own achievements, anything to do with them personally, but because the abuser chose them out of everyone. This can understandably feel gratifying, that you're special and chosen, especially to someone with low self-esteem. But it also means that the abuser gets to decide if the victim is living up to their special standard. And if the victim speaks up or deviates from any of that, then the abuser is perfectly positioned to make them feel ungrateful, especially after they were so lucky to have ended up where they are. Now, Aunt Lydia does this over and over throughout the story.
Oh, you are so lucky, so privileged.
Guilt becomes a powerful weapon against the victim. The whole time there's this deeply uncomfortable implication that disobedience is a personal offense to Aunt Lydia, like it's rejecting a gift, and it's assumed that you have to defend yourself against that. Secondly, the scene juxtaposes affection and punishment. Aunt Lydia goes from electrocuting Janine to gently stroking the face of another girl within an instant, with the promise of understanding how they feel. It's whiplash, and it does two things. When a relationship can so quickly turn to violence like that, you are afraid to ever push the boundaries. You are walking on eggshells. Even when they're being kind, you're always one word away from them coming after you. And secondly, it creates this toxic relationship with affection, this illusion of affection, really, because that affection isn't coming from any love for who you are, but from you conforming to who they expect you to be. But if that's the only affection you get, it can start to feel like it's not worth being yourself anymore. Lastly, Aunt Lydia infantilizes the women who become handmaids.
Welcome to the friggin' loony bin, right?
All right, girls, we will have silence, like little mice.
Girls, she calls them, not women, and likens them to little mice, and you'll notice they're in a classroom like children. The only women she ever refers to are those that came from that decadent, dying, immoral American society that came before Gilead. How this abusive tactic works is that the abuser will place themselves on a wise pedestal, and they will treat any disagreement they have with their partner or child, whoever it may be, as a result of them just not fully understanding everything as well as they do yet. It's very minimizing. It's the implication that they just don't know enough to make their own decisions in this particular matter. Hammer that nail long enough and they might just believe it. They'll conflate disagreement and your emotions with you not having the maturity to understand here, and they'll use that to justify deciding things for you, how you use your body, how you use your money, who you should be friends with, because you don't have the wisdom and experience they do, and you can only be right through them. Abusers like Aunt Lydia work to undermine the victim's sense of agency and decision-making abilities to make them doubt themselves, to make them more dependent on them for validation, almost so they can approve their decisions. This can result in something called enmeshment, where a relationship lacks clear physical and emotional boundaries, all to justify deeper control and interference, because you don't know what you really want, need, or feel, they'll say. In this scene, Aunt Lydia has broken down the boundaries we would normally have with others. She takes any attempt to assert a boundary as a rejection of this twisted kind of care she has for them. Enmeshed people, like the handmaids, partners, or children, are easily abused because they find it difficult to assert themselves and any kind of boundary, and the abuser does not respect it because they view themselves as entitled to cross it, that it's pushing them out of their lives, or being unfair, we've always done it this way before. So much of abuse is how the abuser is able to control how issues and problems in a relationship are framed, and we see that in this scene. Over and over, cruelty is framed as doing what is best for them, that it's their responsibility, that it's only fair. And if you have any problems, it can never be framed as you being legitimately hurt. It can only be that you're being selfish, weak, dumb, or vindictive. But where in the show Aunt Lydia is a domineering, physically present force right from the start, for a long time in the book, she's a ghost, a shadow checking every one of Offred's thoughts. Aunt Lydia is mentioned 28 times across 80 pages by Offred, nearly a quarter of the book before we ever meet her in the flesh. And it's nearly always Offred thinking about doing something and remembering how Aunt Lydia told her she needs to look, feel, and act. I also know better than to say yes. Modesty is invisibility, said Aunt Lydia. Never forget it. To be seen is to be, her voice trembled, penetrated. What you must be, girls, is impenetrable. She called us girls. Where in the show Aunt Lydia is first presented as someone to be contended with in a way, in the book, Aunt Lydia has kind of already won, you might say. There's this illusion of being fine, of safety. There's only ever the implication of violence, but it's always there. She's inside her mind even when she's not there. Aunt Lydia's words are kind and affirmative, describing them as special and valued, likening them to beautiful flowers, but there's always this deeply manipulative and uncomfortable feeling that violence is only ever one mistake away. What we see in Offred is this really difficult mindset where, in the absence of more explicit violence, it's easy to ignore that her life as a handmaid is itself a continuing act of bodily violence. Again, abusers will use this against their victims. There are no beatings, no verbal abuse when you just give into what they want from you, perhaps sexually or otherwise. And suddenly, that coercion doesn't feel as much like violence, but a choice that you consciously made to keep the peace. Again, they're controlling how the issue is framed here, that it was always your choice. And it's because of this that the first scene in which Aunt Lydia appears in the book is really quite chilling. She is an axis around which violence happens, but is never perpetrated by her. It's Janine, telling about how she was gang raped at 14 and had an abortion. She told the same story last week. At testifying, it's safer to make things up than to say you have nothing to reveal. But whose fault was it? Aunt Helena says, holding up one plump finger. Her fault. Her fault. Her fault, we chant in unison. Who laid them on? Aunt Helena beams, pleased with us. She did. She did. She did. And why did God allow such a terrible thing to happen? Teach her a lesson. Teach her a lesson. Teach her a lesson. Last week, Janine burst into tears. Cry, baby. Cry, baby. Cry, baby. We meant it, which is the bad part. I used to think well of myself. I didn't then. That was last week. This week Janine doesn't wait for us to jeer at her. It was my fault, she says. It was my own fault. I led them on. I deserved the pain. Very good, Janine, says Aunt Lydia. You are an example. Aunt Lydia has perfected the ultimate tactic of the abusive. She's weaponized the victims against one another. When we see characters being explicitly cruel or violent, it's rarely ever her at the start, but we know that she's responsible for this atmosphere of mistrust, guilt, and self-hatred. It's so dense that she doesn't even need to threaten anymore. By the time we meet these characters, it has settled, like so many abusive relationships, into this horrible, passive equilibrium. And it's that unknown that makes her terrifying. How did she do this before the story began? And will it come back? Because abuse can be so pervasive that after a time it becomes so deeply rooted that the victim can feel so trapped that they'll do it to themselves. This has been one Villainous scene.